Hi, my name is Victoria Findlay Wolfe. I'm a licensed designer with Sizzix, and today I'm going to show you how to use the Melon Die. We're going to start, I pre-cut some of my fabric to the size of the shape that I'm going to use on my double wedding ring die. I'm going to just be using the concave square, this portion, to be able to use with my Melon Die. So I've picked a fabric. This is some Andover fabric, and I liked it because of the pattern that's already on here. So sometimes looking at your fabrics will do some pretty neat tricks when you're working with a double wedding ring. This one in particular, I'm going to lay my little piece on there. I'm going to bring it over to my Big Shot Pro. My little threads, get those gone. There's my first little shape. And then I've also pre-cut my shapes for the Melon Die. Okay, so we can get up to 8 pieces at a time. I have 4 today so that I can show you how to put those together. Put my pad back on top. Now we have our starter pieces, and here I've just sort of scrap busted. I've just grabbed the fabrics off my wall. I picked out my favorite colors. I'm going to use that to make my double wedding ring using the melon, but you're also able to use your made fabric that I usually like to do, where I can lay that right on and roll that through. Here's just doing some strip piecing. I could use that again as something that I could just cut apart. So however you like to work, you are more than happy to do so. I can line my pieces out, and we can see that that's ultimately what we're going to end up with. So when I start to sew these together, I always find my centers. Finger pressing, or if you have an iron close by, that's always a nice thing to do. I find all my centers on my pieces. This little guy, I can fold it in half again, make everything line up nicely, and I can give this a quick press. Gives it a nice little crease so I can join all the melons around the outside of it. Okay? So now I can see very easily where I'm going to line up my first pieces. So when I do my curves, so many people get so afraid of making curves. They're really not that difficult to do. You can see that there's a 90-degree angle and there's a little point just before it starts to curve. Okay? So when I'm lining up my shapes on the little concave square, the point where the fabric starts to turn there is where this is going to line up on the outside. Okay? So I've made my crease. Let's start there. I pin in my centers. Now here's where I'm going to lay a 1/4 inch over that small little point that you'll see on the die when you've cut out your shapes. And I put a pin in there. Come back here. And really all I'm doing is using 3 pins. What I really love about my Sizzix dies is that they cut accurately. So if I've done that and I pin my 3 pieces, I've got my centers and I have my ends at a 1/4 inch over. When I sew these, my raw edges will very naturally line up perfectly. Okay? Okay, so when I start to sew this, I'm going to keep my hand at the first middle pin, and when I start sewing from the first pin, my raw edges just naturally all line up, okay? That's what I want to happen when I'm going to sew underneath the needle here. So I've sewn my 1/4 inch all the way around. I've used just my 3 pins. Now when I'm going to press it, I can press my seams over to one side. And then I'm going to go on to the next side. Always find your centers when you're sewing curves. If you don't have the mirror image, that's why we're finding the center here. You need the mirror image that's happening with your fabrics, with the curves. Okay, so we have this, the curve that's going to line up. Always start with your middle and then work your way out to that point that's on the Melon Die. So I pin my center, I pin my end. Again, it's going to be a 1/4 inch over that little bump. and a 1/4 inch over on this end. And also, when you're going to sew your curves, if you think of the floppy arc as floppy on toppy, that's what you want to have when you're sewing these, as opposed to the belly here, which is going to be on the bottom, belly on the bottom, and your floppy toppy goes on the top when you're sewing curves. You want the floppiest part to be on top. We're going to give that a quick press. Again, I'm just pressing my curve seam to the outside. So we're left with the 2 opposite pieces ready to sew together here. So again, mark your centers. Okay, right sides together. Now when we're piecing these last 2 in, we're going to be able to come all the way out to the point. Okay, so that little bump that we were lining up before will still line up with the new melon that we're sewing on there, but we get to go all the way out to the edge. So that's going to be one long continuous seam. And when I pin that, I pin straight through my seam at a 1/4 inch, right exactly where I'm going to sew, because that way I know it's not going to move, and I can take my pins out as I get to that point. So again, on the opposite side, I'm lining up from the point, I'm working my way in, and I'm pinning it at that seam at a 1/4 inch at my little bump so that that stays lined up. So that's the way it's going to go, but I want my floppy on top. It's going to go this way. Okay, there's the 3rd one. Let's give that a quick press. Okay, we have our last side. Again, find your center. Quick press. Find your center on your melon. And those 3 magic pins. Curves are really not difficult to do, but they're patience building. And I know we all need a little bit more patience. There's something that's really fun about these if you haven't done a lot of curves. Because of the full melon and that little triangle bend in the arc, it gives you a nice little place to know where to double check yourself when you're sewing so that everything kind of lines up, and it's quite forgiving. So you don't have the element that you have in traditional double wedding rings where there is a seam that has to match up. So we're piecing in a full piece of fabric, which makes it, if it's your first time with curves, a great project to start out with. Okay, so I have my 3 pins in there in place again. I want the floppy part on top. Okay, there's our last side. I'm going to give that a quick press. And now you've completed the first melon, well, a full ring actually, of the double wedding ring using the large melon. Okay, when you're making this quilt, you need to make all of your full rings like this, okay? When you go to put these together then, your concave square is then your extra piece that you're going to keep putting on. So when you're laying out the quilt, you're looking for the large sort of curve that you will be your final row when you're sewing these quilts together. Instead of trying to do a large scallop for piecing, which doesn't work, you're looking for the longest gradual curve. So if I start with this as my first row of the large melon quilt, I'm going to start with a full ring, and then it's going to come around to the narrow part of the concave square, which is going to go to the full ring, right? And then my second row will be the concave square to a full melon to the concave square. So ultimately my row is going to be like a long S shape all the way down the side of the quilt. Now I want to show you a couple other ways that you can use the full melon and adapt it. Because I'm always looking to see what else can I do with my dies. I want to have as many options as possible, right? So whether I've used my made fabric and cutting out my little shapes, right? Gives you a lot of fun information quickly. That's what I've done on this quilt, using my made fabric and Christmas fabrics, letting all those different fabrics come together so that I have a lot of interesting colors and patterns going on inside there. And then ultimately, on the inside pattern of this, also using the full melon, I cut out all of my shapes of the lime green here. I stacked them all up, and then I looked at my pattern and I cut off a wedge on either side of the full melon shape so that I was just left with this sort of cone so that I could easily strip a piece of green and a piece of red across it, so that when you lay the quilt out in general, you're going to get a whole nother element of a full flower inside the quilt. Okay? Not hard to do, but you've just manipulated that information within the shape. Another way you could do is to cut full melon shapes, just like we have done using the Sizzix there. Cut out your shape. I then just use some fusible, like Misty Fuse or another product, applique glue works, where you could just glue it down onto a background square. And then I use some bias tape and top stitch those straight down to the quilt. So you actually have not had any piecing that you've had to do. All you've done is doing top stitch to sew your pieces down onto the quilt. And because of that little bend that's on the die, when I sew my bias tape to the outside, all my little pieces of tape will line up and match up to the next square. Use it as a guide. And another thing I like to do is I can also come back and I could actually mark on my die, if I go a 1/4 inch over the center, if I made a center line across here, I can come back with my Sharpie and I would measure a 1/4 inch above that center line, make a line right on my die, and then I could lay my fabrics and just cut out, lining them up with that line that I've just drawn, and just cut out halves. So then I can come back here, now that I've cut out the dies perfectly in half, all I have to do is chain piece all of those melons in halves, and I've got a full melon again. And I can go about and use my solids that way or any other fabrics and give it yet another effect. Ultimately, on this quilt as well, you can also look at how can you fill those negative spaces. So on the outside edge of this quilt, I've used the same color in the border. So you can change the look of the quilt without actually changing the pattern, which is ultimately what I enjoy the most about using these dies. So that's the full melon die. It's easy. Don't be afraid of the curves.